Welcome to Wellness in Today's World, the podcast where we talk about wellness, psychology, and everything in between. I'm your host, Debra Kawahara, and with each episode, we have thoughtful conversations about how to live well. Today, I am joined by Jennifer Reid, author of Guilt Free, to talk about why guilt shows up in our lives so powerfully and how to tell the difference between guilt that guides us as opposed to guilt that quietly drains us. We'll explore the difference between adaptive guilt and excessive guilt, how socialization and gender roles shape our expectation and what we feel responsible for, and the 4 major areas where excessive guilt tends to show up. More importantly, we'll talk about what people can do to address excessive guilt while remaining caring, engaged, and connected. Jennifer, welcome to the podcast. I'm so glad you're here today.
I'm really excited to be here. This is such a, important area. I'm so thrilled to be able to speak about it.
Wonderful. Well, let's get started. So first, I actually wanted just to talk before we get into the book. What made this such a compelling topic for you to focus on?
Well, it was a problem that I was trying to solve both professionally with so many women in particular in my psychiatry practice, but also personally in my own life as a busy working mom who just perpetually felt like, I was falling behind or I wasn't doing enough. Everything I'd add to my plate, it didn't help that feeling, and it just was starting to get more and more difficult. And when I started to think, how can I help patients with this? How can I think about this differently? I didn't find many answers. I think it feels like a very kind of nebulous emotion. There wasn't even that much kind of research directly on this. And so I really set out to figure it out so that I could take what feels very complex and try and simplify it enough for us just to get started and move away from that feeling.
Mm-hmm. So both professionally as well as personally, this became kind of a question for you of how do we address this? And I know you make a differentiation between adaptive guilt and excessive guilt. So I wanted you to be able to kind of describe the differences.
Well, I think evolutionary biology and psychology is so interesting. And I wanted to figure out, is guilt something that we've just always experienced? And if so, why, right? We tend to hang on to things that are somehow helpful to us over these many years. And when I looked at the research there, it was about kind of interpersonal guilt, or this guilt in relationship or interaction with others. It really is a social emotion. The benefit of it in specific situations is that it actually says, hey, this happened and I'm part of that. I feel awful because I care about you. I don't want you to feel badly. And I actually want to try and fix it. Make a repair, make an apology. And so guilt is adaptive when it's very specific and it's addressing a specific problem. It's kind of like the difference between constant anxiety and, say, fear about something specifically right in front of you, right? So the adaptive guilt, we don't want someone to never feel any guilt because that would be sociopathic, right? That I hurt you and I don't care. That's certainly not what we want for people. But the maladaptive guilt that I'm writing about is just this kind of broad, generalized sense of I'm getting things wrong, I'm failing, I'm not doing enough, even though I seem to be doing more and more. And that is very different because, as you said earlier, it's very draining because it's really a heavy burden, especially on women.
Mm-hmm. So I really hear the adaptive guilt being that part of us that we have empathy, that we can understand our impact on others. But then that it can go to the excessive guilt of where it's starting to drain us, harm us, hurt us, both maybe personally as well as interpersonally. So how can someone kind of tell when the guilt is helpful and when it has kind of gone overboard, let's say, to the excessive guilt area?
Well, I think part of it is, what do we notice about our sort of self-talk, if you will? Are we using a lot of hyperbole, a lot of, I never do X, Y, and Z, or I'm always making this mistake, or I really should, a lot of shoulds coming up, can give us that information. And also that question I would ask women in practice, okay, tell me, if you're feeling guilty, tell me what you did wrong. And they really struggle to come up with a specific thing. It was multiple things, right? They could list 20 things they thought they did wrong that day. So it wasn't specific. So in that way, catching yourself being really critical, feeling like this is occurring across all these aspects of our lives, similar to what it can be like for someone who's struggling with clinical depression. We know guilt is one of our sort of SIGI caps, like key questions, symptoms we ask about. But that feeling seemed to be happening to so many women, even those who weren't in a current state of clinical depression.
What was surprising to me when I was reading the book, even looking at countries in which we think that there's egalitarian or more acceptance in terms of the traditional feminine roles, per se, in terms of keeping care of the house or child rearing. And even then, you kind of showed that women still had this guilt that they were holding.
Yeah, that was so interesting. I mean, these were all westernized countries, so it was, a very, very specific area, and these were case studies. But I was struck especially by Sweden. I think the Scandinavian countries, we think of this sort of aspirational, very much care for mothers have long maternity leave. There's a lot of childcare support paid for by the government. But I was so surprised because even that mom interviewed, right, still said, oh, I feel guilty all the time. I feel guilty that I didn't pick my child up early from this high quality free childcare, or that I didn't choose the perfect one that was going to be best for them. And it just shows, how pervasive this emotion is, and is why I think there have been people interested in this idea in other countries. This is not just a U.S. phenomenon.
Yeah. And to me, and you speak a lot about it in your book, is about socialization and how pervasive it is in terms of how we think about gender roles, how we think about what you were saying, the shoulds, or how am I supposed to, what are my expectations? What socialized patterns or messages do you think are still embedded in our cultures and our societies that lead to this excessive guilt patterns that we're seeing, across many people?
Yeah, socialization is so powerful. And, I could simplify it and just say, what are we taught? And also, what are we praised for?
Mm-hmm.
Because we learn, we're good learners, we are great students. We learn, what is it I need to do from early childhood on up in order to get praise or attention or support or love. So this drives us. And so we're being taught, and it's not just like, oh, I should have ignored that message. No, this was a powerful frame that taught you how to exist in a girl's and then woman's body. So things like expecting to have, this idea of a maternal instinct. I mean, yes, we all have this drive to reproduce and kind of spread our genetics, but I think maternal instinct has been co-opted into the sense that we should want to take care of everybody all the time in a really selfless, kind of exhausting way, as opposed to something more focused. And so I think that's sort of used against us in a sense of, well, you probably enjoy, being the young girl who was always asked to be the babysitter of other siblings, or told she needed to take care of someone else or talk to them because they seemed down and she needed to cheer them up, or even that she would come across that she had it all kind of figured out, was doing everything perfectly. That was how she achieved and was able to get ahead. So these are powerful messages that are still very much ongoing. If you imagine, who in the household should be doing this role, for example, if you were interviewing young children, they would still, less than they used to, but still kind of categorize these in our more traditional gender roles. And so we have a ways to go to really shift those.
And what it made me think about is during the pandemic, when families were in the household together because kids were not going to school, people were working from their homes because we were, isolating. I heard lots of moms saying, I'm trying to work, but then also trying to, situate the kids. I'm having to cook. And this is when you saw those gender roles really being put on the women. And, I know in literature and scholarship that they talk about the second shift, how oftentimes women find themselves. Yes, it's very fulfilling to have a profession, but then I have to go home and I'm still doing all of these things that are traditionally assigned to women or females. And so the second shift we often talk about. So I wanted you to talk about kind of how guilt shows up for across the genders, particularly for women and girls.
Yeah. Well, I think the pandemic is a great example. And that was certainly a time where some of these ideas were coming to me in my own guilt, because it was sort of an extreme example, I think, of the isolation that women experience in trying to work and parent and maybe care for elderly parents of their own. This sense of it, we no longer really have this village of support. We certainly don't have the governmental funding for childcare or elder care that I think we should for the health of all of us. But we don't have the community connection and centering like we maybe used to have when some of these roles were more clear, but at the same time limiting for women. So I think that was an example where we're truly cut off from any support, even some that we'd been able to cobble together over the years prior. And I heard so many women, they were on social media, seeing someone else who was learning how to make sourdough or using this time to get in great shape or become a yoga instructor over video. Like, there was this sense that not only should I be surviving this, I should be thriving and learning new things and putting myself out there and growing. And so I think that we've sort of internalized this belief that if we're not perfect, if we're not getting it right, if we're not able to handle all these tasks at home and work, that somehow it's our fault. And that's where that guilt comes in. We've done something wrong. And in this case, it's like, I'm not Superwoman. Of course not. You're human. But I think we really push back on having human experiences. And I think society is very happy to keep us in that mindset, because what does it do? It keeps us busy. It keeps us providing a lot of free labor, right? A lot of free caretaking, and it keeps things moving, but at women's expense.
And, you have come up with this guilt equation. What I like about it is it very much just clearly lays out how this excessive guilt manifests. And so I want you to talk about that guilt equation and kind of walk the listeners through in a way that they could understand it in everyday kind of life.
Well, I think my favorite teachers are the ones that can take really complex topics and simplify them down to just their key concepts, because then you can grow from there. You can use that in different contexts and see how it applies uniquely in your life. And so for me, it was like, how do I do that with guilt? Because it feels so overwhelming and it's showing up in all these different contexts. The equation is it's very simple, that our guilt is the difference between our expectations of ourselves in our different roles. And we can talk about where those come from, not just from us.
Yes.
Our expectations of ourselves minus our perceived reality. What I mean by that is what we actually perceive or notice about our contributions or the ways that we're potentially meeting or not meeting these expectations. So it's that the space between those two, what I think I should be doing and what I think I am doing, that creates so much guilt. But it also identifies these two key variables that we can change when we get to the I want to move forward part of the process, right? Because we know these are very specific areas we want to start with.
That gap, I guess, between the expectations and then reality, which then creates that guilt. I know you talked about 4, and you call them 4 Furies, but these 4 areas that are pretty prominent in terms of this excessive guilt manifesting. So I wanted you to talk about that, because I actually thought that the 4 categories were right on.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it was, again, how do we understand our own experiences? And there are 100 different triggers, perhaps, or types of expectations we might experience uniquely, but how do we group them enough? Just start getting a sense, start getting a handle on this. And yeah, I call them the 4 Furies, which someone asked me once, why such a powerful word? I said, well, it's a powerful expectations that are being set. But those 4 really, the first one is constant caretaking, that we should, and we should even want to take care of everyone else in our orbit, often at our own expense. Hyper accountability, which is this expectation that we can somehow control someone else's experience. So maybe we're making decisions to try and protect a loved one from having a feeling, even though they are allowed to have that feeling no matter what.
Yes.
So this hyper accountability for other people's experiences is something we don't truly have control over, but we expect ourselves to. The third one is this idea of perfection, perfect self-control, which I think manifests in a lot of different ways, whether it's diet, exercise, alcohol use, how we express our moods, how we spend our time. But this sense that in order to be, a good woman, ideal woman, we need to do things perfectly. We need to be perfect. We need to do things perfectly. And then the last one is a sense of having it all, which is a phrase that always gets to me a little bit because what does that even mean? But I think what it's been interpreted as is I should be able to do all of these different things, including what's expected of me that maybe isn't fair. And I should do it effortlessly. And I should be able to do it without help. The COVID example, I should be able to do all these miraculous things when I'm totally isolated from my entire support network. And so those 4 areas, constant caretaking, hyper accountability, seeking perfection, and then having it all are broad categories that I think women can start to say, okay, I'm noticing this. If I've used this equation, what expectation category? Maybe it falls outside, but if it falls in, it just gives you a sense of, I'm not alone in this, right? The reason there are these major categories is because thousands of women that I've worked with have experienced them, not because you're doing this to yourself on your own. So that was really important to me too, this sense of women not doing this to themselves and not being alone.
Yeah. And I think earlier you talked about potential areas that are contributing to this excessive guilt and that powerfulness of socialization. Because I even know it's like, even if you're trying to counter it, media, especially social media, where the perception that, look at that person, they're doing it all. How come I'm not able to do it? Or I'm feeling bad because I'm not being able to do it all. What other things do you think account for this excessive guilt that we're seeing people really internalize, I guess?
I do think that the idea of comparisons is really powerful in that even in our day-to-day lives, we choose perhaps who we're going to compare ourselves to. But I think in this algorithmic world of social media, things are just projected at us all the time. We're not choosing, oh, that would be a person I might want to compare myself to. We're just being blasted with examples of sort of the extremes of what people are projecting. And so I do talk about, instead of saying she's perfect, okay, she's projecting an image of perfection, that there's a difference there. There's a difference between that is reality and that is what's being projected toward me. We know those are two different things, right? But I think comparisons, which data suggests, some research suggests that we actually compare more when we're already feeling down about ourselves. That's a perfect storm, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then another area that I think the more I kind of got into it with the reading, or writing the book, it came out. It was these ideas that guilt helps us in some ways, costly ways, but in some ways, like maybe providing brief motivation, even though we're relying on self-criticism and harsh self-talk to get there, that maybe it's a bit motivating, but again, at a high cost and in a way that isn't sustainable. You're starting from behind, right? Instead of saying like, just do it, you're saying, oh, I should have done that already, So that's not a great slogan.
Yeah.
And then guilt can protect us in a sense from feelings that might be really hard even to feel, or maybe we're told we weren't supposed to express them, or when we did express them, people in our lives would sort of shut down or step away from us. So guilt can protect us from things like grief or anger or sadness. But unfortunately, then it's hard to identify the true emotion underneath that, and even more difficult to process that emotion.
I know one of the prominent feelings that oftentimes with clients I'm working with is not wanting to disappoint someone else. And so then that becomes kind of that motivation of guilt. Like, I should do this. I'm supposed to do this if I really care about this person. And so I can really see how this guilt propels us to do things, even though I think you talked about, like, when we think about sacrificing ourselves, over functioning, abandoning maybe, what may be in our best interests in order to be able to do the things that we want to do.
Yeah, and that's just so painful to see that happening. I think that disappointment was a big issue. It's still a very big issue for so many of us. It's become this almost this belief that it's the disappointment itself is really damaging in some way. And I think when you really think about it, you've had many disappointments throughout your life, and you've been able to move forward. Like, this is not something that is truly stifling. So when we work so hard to try and protect someone else from a feeling of disappointment, we make decisions based on guilt or a sense of obligation to try and protect them from feeling disappointed, which again, they could anyway.
Yes.
And so I think, how do we normalize that disappointment is a normal part of human life for us to feel, but also we can't be everything to everyone all the time. So in order to interact with others, we are going to disappoint people, potentially often, because there's one of us.
Yes.
And so many of them. But I think bending over backwards or immediately trying to fix disappointment if we feel it from someone, it sends a message that it's dangerous, and it often puts us in this place of just exhaustion and continued guilt.
Yeah. And, related concepts that I often, you're working with clients and even myself, of it being okay to rest or to have boundaries, and how hard that is for people to feel okay with saying, you know what, I'm exhausted. I would love to do this for you, but I got to take care of myself. And they will feel guilty for, why do I need to rest? This feels bad to put a boundary between me and this person saying no.
Yeah, isn't that, the idea of rest being somehow wrong, I think it gets at a number of those furies of expectations, one being the constant caretaking, because constant caretaking doesn't actually include us, right? This expectation is often everyone else, even at my expense. And so turning inward and saying, I need to take a break or rest or have any care applied to me is breaking that promise, is moving away from that expectation. And it's also, as you said, I shouldn't need this idea that if we are perfectly balanced, we're eating the right things, sleeping the right amount, doing everything right, we should not need anything that could inconvenience someone else. But again, we're human. We absolutely do.
Exactly. And it goes to that perfectionism. We're supposed to be the perfect human. And it's like, no, you're human.
Yeah.
That means, you need to rest, and sometimes you may be tired. And that concept of doing it all, being it all for everyone is, and then it gets to, except for yourself. Right.
That somehow you will treat other people. And this is an idea from self-compassion we can talk about, is how would you say this to a friend? How would you help a friend in this moment? Is very different than the way we speak to ourselves. And that's true of care. Boundaries too. Boundaries are so important. And my reframe for boundaries, which helps me as well, is that they're not walls. They're not putting up sort of separation from you and someone you care about. They're protective scaffolding that allow you to move toward them, to move toward connection, because they're sort of rules of engagement, right? And if I know that you are going to, support and really align with my boundaries, I can move toward you because I'm not afraid that you will just blow right past the limits I've tried to set, or just, totally overwhelm me with your need. So I think boundaries help build connection rather than separating you from people you care about.
I really like that. It's almost like setting the rules of engagement so that we're not guessing how we're supposed to interact. And I'm not guessing about your behavior, like why you're doing what you're doing. Right.
Right. Because, otherwise someone may set zero boundaries and all of a sudden they're just absent. They're just gone from your life. They've ghosted, right? Or vice versa. You feel yourself pulling away. And that's because when boundaries are crossed over and over again, it just really, it pushes you apart.
I know one of the things that you have done, and I was able to take a look at, you have come up with this guilt equation inventory, which really lays out both the Furies as well as, how it shows up. So I wanted you to talk about that a little bit, because I know at least the one I looked at is helpful for clinicians, But I also wanted to know whether, people that are listening and reading your book, if they could also benefit from the inventory that you created.
Yeah, I mean, as someone who's been in academic medicine, right, you understand that
Yes.
it's important to think, how could this be applied in sort of a systematic way so people can really get a sense of it? A book is in narrative form and it's sort of long form. So how can I really make this a focused sort of questionnaire that I could use to ask a number of different people and sort of see, is my hypothesis that women have so much more guilt in this area than men, for example? How would that play out? And I am working with one of my colleagues at Penn to try and come up with some initial research to get some data on this to see and compare, right, in our population. But the guilt equation inventory is just going through sort of the 4 Furies, maybe 4 questions for each, answered 1 through 4. 1 is never, 4 is all the time, right? So questions like, do I feel badly if I'm not doing something for someone else at every minute, right? Or do I make decisions based on trying to protect someone else's feelings or help them feel a certain way? It just goes through these really key questions that I think help people delineate, is this an area that I really struggle with? Maybe all 4 will apply for them. Maybe one really stands out and they're like, okay, this is where I can put some effort first, right? I think that's one of the real benefits as clinicians. If someone does a worksheet or a questionnaire and we can really pinpoint where they're having the most trouble. So it goes through those Furies. And then the other questions are about some of these stickier functions of guilt, like guilt as motivation, guilt as protecting us from other more difficult feelings. Guilt is somehow this like proof that we care, which I think is another really sticking point, a lot of sticking points for guilt. And the questionnaire does go through those. What I'm hoping to do, I'm working with someone to try and put the questionnaire on my website so people can just fill it out and they kind of get their answer, their results, and then some sort of key ideas to keep in mind as they go forward. So I'm working on getting that set up, similar to what they have in positive psychology at Penn. They have a number of these things you can fill out. And so how do I help people just be able to learn more about themselves?
Wonderful. And, if someone's listening and they're going, that really sounds like me, actually, what could they do just to begin to explore this and kind of see, maybe this is an area that I want to work on and improve in?
Well, I think they already are one step into that, right? Which is that noticing, observing in themselves, oh, this sounds like me. It's like they had to take some time and attention to even notice that in the first place, right? Because we could just blow right past it. So if we talk about, I came up with this sort of step-by-step process, which mirrors psychotherapy, which is the SPEAK process. The S stands for showing up. And I would say that that's an example of someone showing up and saying, I'm noticing this. I want to work on it. I'm valuable enough to take time and energy and direct it inward. That's a powerful step. And then the P is for paying attention. Again, I notice. I'm noticing this thought. I'm catching a guilty thought. As you know, right, we are not our thoughts. We're not our guilty thoughts, our anxious thoughts. And the more we can really start to trust that and know that we are something deeper and sort of more grounded than that, we can start to make this change. So it's paying attention. E is for examining the evidence. These are very simple terms, right? But we're examining when those thoughts come up more frequently, certain relationships, certain environments. Maybe I come home from work, see my kids, and the guilt goes boop. So really, assessing that. And then A is sort of this next piece we can speak about is kind of the take action. How do we adjust both of those variables that we talked about in the equation? And then K is just keep going. I wanted to be clear that this is not a one and done. Like anything else in our lives, this does take practice, and you're rewiring your brain. It takes some time to do so, right?
Yeah. So it seems like being able to identify and acknowledge that it's there. I know naming it, so that has power in it, and then figuring out what are you going to do, but knowing it's a process and being compassionate. I always tell my clients to be compassionate and kind to yourself. This is going to take some time, and it's kind of like riding a bike. It's at first, it's really kind of not automatic and natural, but you'll get it. And slowly it'll get easier and easier.
Yeah. And I think that clinicians, when they're thinking, how can I help someone who's having this guilt? Even just teaching the equation is a way for them to apply it. I mean, I use it throughout my day. Okay, what expectation am I trying to meet here? Is it fair? And then where we start to do some of that change is if it's not fair. And if it's based on comparisons on social media or something else that really is not who we want to be taking advice from, how do we rewrite that? If the first draft is, I should be everything to everyone, starting there, how can we edit that according to our values, right? Like I'm a mother of two, and there are aspects of that I want to be caretaking in these areas. I want to be available if they've had a tough day and they want to talk, or, what are the things that I really want to prioritize? And what are these sky high expectations? I'm going to make a healthy dinner every single night with like homemade ingredients and grow them all in my garden. Like, yes, in an ideal world, but that's not where I am putting my time. And that's okay. Like, what is it that's most important to me in aligning with my values? And that's how I can try and reshape these expectations that make sense for me.
One of the things I want to be clear, I guess, about is, yes, there's internal work, but there's also the context in which we live in. And so I wanted to ask you, because I don't think we should only put the responsibility on the individual, that within our context, we know, and you talked about socialization and, the constant messages that we're getting that kind of reinforce these excessive guilt patterns that are developed. What do you think needs to change in families, in workplaces, in society at large to kind of help, reduce and combat this excessive guilt that we know is embedded in the way that we live, in the way that we grew up, and things like that. So I wanted to make sure we talk about the context so that we don't just say, oh, this is your individual problem and you go and fix it.
Right. That yes, maybe we can do this change within ourselves, but if we go out into a world that then gives us a message that says you can't move forward unless you adhere to these expectations. I do see more and more that guilt is a type of social control, that it's a powerful type of social control in that it tells us, don't pay attention to what's happening here, whether it's kind of rollbacks and different, women's bodily autonomy, women's rights across different areas. Like, don't pay attention to that. Look inward and try and fix whatever's creating this guilt. And so I think that, like I said, there are many organizations, even family, within a family dynamic, we know families are very resistant to change, and they may really benefit from you living in that guilt, world, in that guilt isolation, because you're trying to fix yourself and not asking much of them or as much of them as maybe they could. So I think within families, I've had, men who've come to events and asked me, what can men do in this situation? I do think the guilt equation certainly applies to men. They're not free of guilt, nor should they be, but they have different expectations on them, sometimes equally painful and equally difficult in their sort of specific context. It's just how broad this is for women that really comes up. So I talk about that, all the amazing women who've gone before us, the recent woman astronaut around the moon, and the women trainer who trained the winner of the Kentucky Derby, which every time I watch clips on that, I start crying. I don't know why. It's just so beautiful. Like, the women have pushed and been able to move and open doors and create opportunities. But I don't think the societal expectations, again, of what a mother should be or what a good daughter would be, they haven't really caught up. And I think that it really behooves us to make this change, because for societies, things are going to be more balanced when more women, doesn't have to be more women than men. It's not like I'm saying we need to evaporate all the men, but we need to have a seat at the table and not be apologizing for having a voice there, right? Not being said, I should feel guilty for putting forth an idea that might challenge the status quo or might say that women could step forward in areas where previously they've been excluded. And so I do think that societally we have to open up to what are the many different ways that a woman could show up and contribute in our society, not limit them to a certain area or sort of pigeonhole them into that so that they don't have the opportunity. Some may really love nurturing, caretaking. That may really give them so much meaning. My mom volunteers at an animal shelter. She gives all of her time and she loves it. It feels so good for her. But that doesn't have to be the only path to being a successful or like a truly engaged woman in modern society.
Yeah. And as you were talking, what it made me think is allowing people to choose how
Mm,
they're going to live and how they're going to thrive. Um,
yes.
and if they choose that caretaking is how they get satisfaction, that's wonderful. But that for somebody else, it may be completely different, and that we create kind of a society that is accepted of all those different ways of being. Yeah.
Yeah, isn't that a wonderful, I mean, imagining that, I've been thinking a lot about sort of the midlife transition and what comes after that. What are the paths that we could open up for women to emulate someone, to move forward, as opposed to that being such an ending? Because I think some of the stories that we've been told and that we're sort of repeating to ourselves are very limiting, right? It
Mhm.
doesn't mean menopause doesn't mean you're done contributing or done feeling joy or done having romance or desire or any of these other things. So how do we kind of rewrite these stories so that women coming behind us aren't trying to adhere to the very same script, right? They have, like you said, choices and options.
Absolutely. And I mean, I guess right now I do see a surgent of conversations around this second part of life, you know.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because it hasn't been focused on. For some reason, there was some stigma about talking about this stage of life,
Hmm.
perimenopause, menopause, and afterwards, even
Hmm.
though half the planet is women. So anyways, I am very glad that we actually are starting to talk about it
Yeah.
and give women information about it. And, you know, what are going to be some things that you need to think about as you move into this
Right.
stage of life?
Because you said naming is so important. You can't push back against a shadow. Like to be able to see what you're facing, name it, really describe it. I feel like that allows us to face it in with much more courage because we can kind of see, what's coming. Even if it's
Mhm.
difficult, we can see what's coming.
We know that it's easier if you can prepare and plan because you have information, as opposed to uncertainty and volatility and chaos, right? And so that becomes so important.
And that community, when I've done groups where I've spoken to a room full of women about this topic and they all can kind of find different ways that guilt's showing up for them, many of whom didn't realize that's what it was for so long. And they're like, oh, wow, I didn't realize how pervasive this was. And that's really a powerful place. It's so exciting. I mean, I don't want to hear that they're struggling, but I know that this is something's going to shift for them now that they've realized what's been happening.
Well, I know that we're getting towards the end of our time. For someone listening right now who's constantly feeling weighed down by guilt, and doesn't know how to let it go, what would be key takeaways? And I will tell you that in her book, there are more key gems that I think you will learn. But I wanted you to talk about some key takeaways that someone that's listening today could take.
Well, was so important for me to be clear that women are not alone individually in these experiences. And I really see power in community for change. We don't do the consciousness raising groups necessarily anymore, but I even created these sort of guilt-free groups where people could just download kind of a guide and go through the book together and sort of say, okay, let's talk about our individual experiences here. Ideally, women of different generations, right? Because we're all going through this a little bit differently, but there are these common threads. So for me, it's recognizing you're not alone and maybe trying to find other women that you could start talking to just about guilt. You could teach them the guilt equation if you're a clinician or just speaking to a friend. Here's something you could try in your day-to-day life. See what comes up for you. And I'd love to share mine and talk back and forth about this, right? Because again, paying attention to where that guilt is coming up, we're trying to each figure out our unique triggers, but again, there are through lines here. So it's sort of finding that community, having these conversations. You can help motivate each other that, yes, I am important enough to put forth this effort and time and attention to actually feel sort of more like myself again, sort of like an art restoration, like illuminating this beautiful color within. This is what I'm really hoping we can do to help each other.
That's beautiful. That is just really beautiful. And Jennifer, I just want to thank you for being here today and sharing your wisdom and your insights about becoming guilt-free. And I would say empowering people to be able to live their life better. So it's been a pleasure having you on the podcast. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to speak with you.
Wonderful. And to the listeners, thank you for being here today. And as always, remember, wellness is a journey, not a destination. Please take good care of yourself, and we'll see you here the next time.